She got off at the wrong station, and that single mistake cost her everything. Clara Bennett thought she was running toward salvation when she boarded that westbound train. Instead, she stepped off into a frozen nowhere, watching her last hope disappear into the blizzard. No money, no ticket back. 3 days until the next train, if she survived that long. But this isn't a story about a woman who gave up. This is about what happens when you're too stubborn to die, too angry to apologize for existing, and too damn desperate to care what anyone thinks. Stay until the end. Like this video. Comment your city below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The cold hit like a fist. Clara Bennett stood on the platform, if you could call 4 rotting planks and a rusted sign a platform, and watched the train pull away. The sound of it faded into the howl of wind, swallowed by snow and distance, until there was nothing left but silence and the gut-twisting realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd gotten off too early. The conductor had called out something, she was sure of it, but the words had been muffled, lost in the noise of the engine and her own desperate thoughts. She'd been so focused on not missing her stop that she'd jumped at the first sign of slowing, her carpet bag clutched against her chest like it could shield her from the world. Now the train was gone, and she was alone. Clara turned in a slow circle, her breath coming out in sharp white clouds. The station, if it even deserved that name, was nothing more than a wooden shack leaning hard to one side, its door half open and banging in the wind. Beyond it, there was nothing. No town, no lights, just endless white stretching in every direction, broken only by the skeletal outline of mountains in the distance. Her fingers were already numb inside her gloves. She pulled her coat tighter, though it did almost nothing. The fabric was thin, meant for city winters. Not this. Not the kind of cold that felt like it wanted to kill you. Stupid, she muttered, her voice cracking. Stupid, stupid. She bit down on the word before it could turn into something worse. Crying wouldn't help. Panicking wouldn't help. She needed to think. The next train wasn't for 3 days. She knew that much. The schedule had been burned into her brain after weeks of planning this trip, saving every penny, lying to everyone she knew about where she was going and why. 3 days. She had 17 cents in her pocket, half a loaf of bread in her bag, and a coat that might as well have been made of paper. Clara looked at the shack again. It wasn't much, but it was something. Shelter. Maybe there'd be a stove inside, or at least walls thick enough to block the wind. She trudged toward it, her boots sinking into snow that came up past her ankles. Each step was harder than the last, her legs burning with the effort. She wasn't built for this, wasn't built for much of anything, according to most people. Too heavy. Too slow. Too plain. She'd heard it all her life, in whispers and sideways glances, in the way men looked past her like she wasn't there, and women smiled with pity that felt worse than cruelty. The door to the shack groaned as she pushed it open. Inside it was darker and colder than she'd hoped. There was no stove, no furniture, just bare walls, a dirt floor, and a pile of what looked like old feed sacks in the corner, stiff with frost. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Okay," she said aloud, because hearing her own voice made it feel less like the world had swallowed her whole. "Okay, this is fine. You've been in worse." That was a lie, but she said it anyway. She set her carpet bag down and moved to the corner, dragging the feed sacks into something resembling a pile. They smelled like mildew and animal, but they were better than nothing. She sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest, and wrapped her arms around herself. The wind screamed outside. Clara closed her eyes and tried to think of what came next. The plan had been simple. Get to Ridgefield, find her cousin Margaret, start over. Margaret had written months ago, saying there was work in town, that Clara could stay with her until she got on her feet. But Ridgefield was still 2 stops away. And Clara was here. Wherever here was. She opened her eyes and stared at the open door, at the snow piling up just beyond the threshold. She should close it, trap whatever heat there was inside. But she didn't move, because part of her, a small bitter part she tried not to listen to, wondered if it would be easier to just let the cold win. No. The thought came sharp and mean, cutting through the fog in her head. She'd come too far for that, given up too much. She wasn't going to die in some forgotten shack in the middle of nowhere just because she'd been too distracted to hear a damn conductor. Clara pushed herself to her feet and crossed to the door, slamming it shut. The wind rattled it in its frame, but it held. She went back to her corner and sat down again, this time pulling one of the feed sacks over her shoulders like a blanket. It didn't help much, but it was something. Time passed in a strange, fluid way. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like nothing. At some point, the light outside began to fade. Clara's stomach growled, a hollow, insistent ache that reminded her she hadn't eaten since morning. She reached for her carpet bag and pulled out the bread, tearing off a small piece. It was hard and stale, but she chewed it slowly, making it last. The wind outside grew louder. She tried not to think about what would happen if it didn't stop, if the snow kept falling, if no one came. But those thoughts crept in anyway, cold and relentless. What if the next train didn't come? What if it did, but she was already frozen by then? What if no one even noticed she was missing? That last one hurt the most. Clara wrapped her arms tighter around herself and tried to remember warmth. Tried to remember what it felt like to sit by a fire, to have a full belly, to hear someone say her name like it mattered. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, there was a sound. Not the wind. Something else. Footsteps. Clara's eyes snapped open. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. The door rattled. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming fast and shallow. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice hoarse. The door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, backlit by the dim gray light of dusk. He was tall, taller than anyone she'd ever seen, with broad shoulders and a face mostly hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. Snow clung to his coat, thick and crusted. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there looking at her. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She started, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? That she wasn't trespassing? That she had every right to be here? She didn't even know where here was. The man took a step inside and Clara took a step back. "Easy," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel shifting underfoot. "Not here to hurt you." Clara didn't move, didn't speak. He looked around the shack, his gaze sweeping over the feed sacks, her carpet bag, the half-eaten loaf of bread. "You get off the train?" he asked. She nodded. "Alone?" Another nod. He let out a breath that might have been a sigh or just exhaustion. "Train's not stopping here again for 3 days." "I know," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. The man studied her for a long moment, and she forced herself to hold his gaze. She'd learned a long time ago that looking away made people think you were weak, or guilty, or both. "You'll freeze before then," he said. "Maybe." His jaw tightened, just barely. "That your plan?" "No." "Then what is?" Clara didn't have an answer for that, so she said nothing. The man glanced out at the storm, then back at her. Something shifted in his expression, something she couldn't quite read. "Got a ranch about 2 miles west," he said. "You can work for a few days, earn a meal, a bed. When the train comes, you leave." Clara blinked. "Work?" "Cooking, cleaning, things that need doing." "I don't—" "Wasn't asking if you could," he cut in. "Asking if you will." She hesitated. Every instinct she had screamed at her to say no, to not follow a strange man into the middle of nowhere, no matter how desperate she was. But desperation was a funny thing. It made the impossible seem reasonable. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ethan Ward." "I'm Clara Bennett." He gave a short nod, like that settled it. "You coming or not?" Clara looked at the shack, at the feed sacks, at the thin walls that wouldn't hold against another night of this cold. Then she looked at Ethan Ward. "I'm coming," she said. The walk to the ranch felt endless. Ethan moved ahead of her, his strides long and steady, cutting a path through snow that came up to Clara's knees. She struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs screaming with every step. He didn't slow down, didn't look back. Clara gritted her teeth and pushed forward. She wasn't going to ask him to wait, wasn't going to give him a reason to regret bringing her along. By the time the ranch came into view, her whole body was shaking. It wasn't much to look at. A low, rough-built house with a sagging porch and a barn that looked like it had seen better days. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and gray against the darkening sky. But it was shelter. And right now, that was everything. Ethan stopped at the porch steps and finally turned to look at her. His eyes were hard, unreadable. "Few things you need to know," he said. "You do your work, you keep to yourself, you don't ask questions. Understood?" Clara nodded. "I've got a son. He's blind. You're kind to him or you leave. No second chances." "I understand." Ethan held her gaze a moment longer, then pushed open the door. The warmth hit her like a wall. Clara stepped inside, her legs nearly buckling with relief. The house was dim, lit only by the fire and the hearth, but it was warm. Blessedly, impossibly warm. A boy sat near the fire, his hands folded in his lap. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, with dark hair and a face too serious for his age. He turned his head toward the sound of the door, his eyes unfocused. "Papa?" he said. "I'm here, Noah," Ethan said, his voice softer than Clara had heard it. "Brought someone to help out for a few days." Noah tilted his head, listening. "Who?" "Her name's Clara." The boy's face lit up, not with a smile exactly, but with something close. Interest, curiosity. "Hello, Clara," he said. Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Hello, Noah." Ethan moved past her, shrugging off his coat. "You'll sleep in the back room. There's a bed, a wash basin, supper's in an hour." Clara nodded, though he wasn't looking at her anymore. She stood there for a moment, awkward and out of place, until Noah spoke again. "Do you like stories?" he asked. Clara blinked. Yes. I suppose I do." "Papa doesn't tell them much anymore," Noah said, his voice quiet. "But I like to hear them." Ethan's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't say anything. Clara looked at the boy, at the hopeful tilt of his head, and felt something crack open in her chest. "I'll tell you one after supper," she said. Noah's smile was small but real, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara thought maybe, just maybe, she'd done something right. Supper was silent. Ethan ate with his head down, methodical and joyless. Noah sat beside him, his hands moving carefully over his plate, finding each piece of bread, each bite of stew, with practiced precision. Clara ate slowly, her stomach still adjusting to the warmth and the food. The stew was simple, potatoes, carrots, a little bit of meat, but it tasted like the best thing she'd ever had. No one spoke. When they were finished, Ethan stood and began clearing the table. Clara moved to help, but he waved her off. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. Clara sat. Noah reached out, his hand searching for hers. She let him find it, his small fingers wrapping around hers with surprising strength. "Will you tell me a story now?" he asked. Clara glanced at Ethan, who had his back to them, his hands deep in the wash basin. "If it's all right with your father," she said. Ethan didn't turn around. "Do what you want." Clara looked down at Noah, at the hope in his face, and made a decision. "All right," she said. "Let me think of a good one." She told him about a girl who got lost in the woods and found a house made of light. It wasn't a story she'd heard before. She made it up as she went, pulling pieces from half-remembered fairy tales in her own imagination. Noah listened, his eyes wide and fixed somewhere past her shoulder, like he could see it all unfolding in his mind. When she finished, he smiled. "That was good," he said. "Will you tell me another tomorrow?" "If you'd like." "I would." Ethan finally turned around, his expression unreadable. "Bedtime, Noah," he said. The boy stood without complaint, letting his father guide him toward a small room off the main hall. Clara watched them go, then rose and began clearing the rest of the table. She worked quietly, washing the dishes and setting them to dry, her hands moving on instinct. When Ethan came back, she was wiping down the table. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He stood there for a moment, arms crossed, watching her. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. Clara looked up, meeting his eyes. "You always this suspicious?" His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Get some rest," he said. "Work starts early." Clara nodded and made her way to the back room. It was small and bare, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out onto the snow. But it was warm, and it was hers, at least for now. She sat down on the bed and let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time in days, she let herself believe she might actually survive this. The first day of work was harder than Clara expected. Ethan woke her before dawn, knocking once on her door and walking away before she could answer. By the time she dragged herself out of bed and into the main room, he was already dressed and waiting. "Chickens need feeding," he said. "Stalls need mucking. Fire needs tending. You figure out the rest." Then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him. Clara stood there, still half asleep, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. Noah appeared a few minutes later, moving carefully through the room with one hand trailing along the wall. "Good morning," he said. "Morning," Clara replied, her voice rough. "Papa's always like that in the mornings," Noah said, as if reading her thoughts. "Don't take it personal." Clara almost laughed. "I'll try not to." She spent the next several hours working her way through Ethan's list. The chickens were easy enough: scatter feed, collect eggs, avoid getting pecked. The stalls were another story. She'd never mucked a stall in her life, and it showed. By the time she finished, she was covered in sweat and God knew what else, her arms shaking with exhaustion. But she didn't stop. She tended the fire, swept the floors, scrubbed the table until it gleamed. By midday, the house looked better than it had in what must have been months. Ethan came in around noon, stamping snow off his boots. He looked around, his expression neutral. "You eat?" he asked. Clara shook her head. He grunted and moved to the stove, pulling out leftover stew and a hunk of bread. He set it on the table without a word. Clara sat down and ate, too tired to be self-conscious. Ethan stood by the fire, watching her. "You do good work," he said finally. It wasn't much, but coming from him, it felt like everything. The days blurred together after that. Clara fell into a rhythm: wake before dawn, work until her body screamed, collapse into bed, and do it all again the next day. But something was shifting. The house was changing, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but changing all the same. The floors stayed clean. The fire stayed lit. Meals appeared on the table at regular hours, hot and filling. And Noah was changing too. He laughed more, talked more, reached for Clara's hand whenever she was near, like he'd been starved for touch and didn't know how to ask for it. Ethan noticed. Clara could see it in the way he watched them, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name. One night, after Noah had gone to bed, Ethan sat down across from her at the table. "He's getting attached," he said. Clara looked up from the sock she was mending. "Is that a bad thing?" "Might be." "Why?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared into the fire, his hands folded on the table. "Because you're leaving," he said finally. "And he's already lost enough." Clara set down the sock. "What did he lose?" Ethan's jaw worked. "His mother." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Clara didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. "She died 2 years ago," Ethan continued, his voice flat. "Fever took her in 3 days. Noah doesn't remember much, but he remembers enough." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. Don't make it harder than it has to be." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what she'd been too tired, too distracted to see before. He wasn't just guarded. He was terrified. "I won't," she said. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true. Christmas Eve came faster than Clara expected. She woke that morning to find snow falling again, thick and soft, covering the world in a clean white blanket. Noah was already awake, sitting by the fire with a piece of wood in his hands, running his fingers over it. "Morning," Clara said. "Morning," Noah replied, his face lighting up. "It's Christmas Eve." "It is." "Are we going to do anything special?" Clara glanced toward Ethan's room. The door was closed. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We'll have to see." But as the day went on, it became clear that Ethan had no intention of celebrating. He worked outside most of the day, coming in only for meals, his face set in hard lines. Noah tried to hide his disappointment, but Clara saw it. That evening, after Ethan had gone back outside, Clara made a decision. She pulled out the last of the flour and sugar, found a few eggs, and set to work. By the time Ethan came back inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and warmth. He stopped in the doorway, staring. "What's this?" he asked. "Cake," Clara said, pulling it from the oven. "For Christmas." Noah's face broke into a grin. "Really? Really?" Ethan didn't say anything. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. But when they sat down to eat, he took a piece. And for the first time since Clara had arrived, the house didn't feel quite so cold. The cake sat between them on the table, half-eaten and listing slightly to one side where Clara hadn't quite gotten the layers even. Noah had devoured his piece with the kind of joy that made Clara's chest ache, his fingers finding every crumb, his face smeared with frosting he didn't bother to wipe away. Ethan had been quieter. He'd eaten his slice slowly, methodically, like he was trying to decide whether to be grateful or angry that she'd done this without asking. Clara couldn't tell which way he'd landed. "Papa," Noah said, licking his fingers, "can Clara tell another story?" Ethan set down his fork. "It's late." "Just one?" "Noah, please?" There was something in the boy's voice that made Ethan pause. Not just hope, desperation, like he was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping through his fingers. Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked at Clara, and she saw it again, that flash of fear beneath the hard exterior. "One story," he said finally. "Then bed." Noah's face split into a grin. Clara told him about a boy who could hear the stars singing. It was softer than her other stories, quieter, and she wasn't sure where it came from. But Noah listened like every word mattered, his hands still in his lap, his unseeing eyes fixed somewhere beyond the firelight. When she finished, he didn't move for a long moment. "Do you think the stars really sing?" he asked. "Maybe," Clara said. "Maybe they do, and we just don't know how to listen." Noah smiled at that. "I'd like to hear them." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Bed, Noah. Now." The boy's smile faded, but he didn't argue. He stood and reached for his father's hand, letting Ethan guide him toward his room. Clara started clearing the table, stacking plates with hands that suddenly felt too clumsy. She heard the low murmur of Ethan's voice from Noah's room, the creak of the bed frame, the rustle of blankets. When Ethan came back, she was washing the dishes. He stood in the doorway watching her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The cake?" "Any of it." Clara kept scrubbing, her hands moving in steady circles. "He's a child. Children should have Christmas." "We don't celebrate it here." "Why not?" Ethan's silence stretched long enough that Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he crossed the room and leaned against the counter beside her, arms folded. "His mother loved Christmas," he said quietly. "Made a whole damn production of it. Decorations, songs, presents we couldn't afford. She'd start planning in October." Clara set down the plate she was holding. "And now it just reminds you of her." "Everything reminds me of her." The words came out raw, like they'd been dragged from somewhere deep. Clara dried her hands on a towel and turned to face him. "So you stopped celebrating, stopped decorating, stopped everything that might make him happy because it hurts too much." Ethan's eyes went hard. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" "You've been here less than a week. Long enough to see what you're doing to him." Ethan pushed off the counter, his whole body tense. "I'm keeping him safe." "From what? Joy?" "From getting his hopes up." Ethan's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "From thinking things can go back to the way they were. They can't, Clara. She's gone, and pretending otherwise doesn't help him." "I'm not asking you to pretend," Clara shot back. "I'm asking you to let him be a child." "He is a child." "Then stop making him live in a grave." The words hit like a slap. Ethan's face went white, then red. For a moment, Clara thought he might yell, might tell her to get out, to leave right now, storm or no storm. But he didn't. He just stood there, breathing hard, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't get it," he said finally, his voice low and shaking. "You don't know what it's like to lose someone like that. To wake up one day and have everything just gone. To have to explain to your son why his mother isn't coming back, why the world doesn't make sense anymore." Clara met his eyes, unflinching. "You're right. I don't know what that's like, but I know what it's like to be unwanted, to feel like you're a burden no matter what you do. And if you keep this up, that's exactly what Noah's going to feel. Ethan flinched like she'd struck him. Clara's heart was pounding, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and something close to rage. She'd never talked to anyone like this. Had spent her whole life making herself smaller, quieter, less. But not here. Not now. "I'm not trying to replace her," Clara said, her voice softer but no less firm. "I'm just trying to give him a reason to smile. And if that's too much for you to handle, then maybe you should have left me at that station." Ethan stared at her, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Then he turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands trembling, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She'd overstepped. She knew that. This wasn't her house, wasn't her child, wasn't her life to interfere with. But damn it, someone had to say it. She finished the dishes in silence, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. When she finally went to bed, she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering if Ethan would tell her to leave in the morning, wondering if she even cared anymore. The next morning, Ethan didn't mention the argument. He woke her at the usual time, knocked once, and was gone before she opened the door. When Clara made her way to the kitchen, he was already outside, his figure barely visible through the window as he worked in the barn. Noah was at the table, his hands folded in his lap. "Good morning," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Morning." Noah tilted his head toward her. "Did you and Papa fight last night?" Clara's stomach dropped. "You heard that?" "Some of it. The walls aren't very thick." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Noah's voice was quiet, thoughtful. No one's talked to him like that in a long time. Clara sat down across from him, unsure what to say. "Mama used to," Noah continued. "When he'd get all quiet and stubborn, she'd tell him he was being ridiculous. Made him laugh, usually." "I don't think I made him laugh." Noah smiled a little. "No, but maybe you made him think." Clara wasn't so sure about that, but she didn't argue. They ate breakfast in silence, and when Ethan came in an hour later, he still didn't look at her, just grabbed a piece of bread and disappeared again. The day passed in a strange, tense quiet. Clara worked, fed the chickens, scrubbed the floors, mended clothes that had been sitting in a basket for what looked like months. She moved through the house like a ghost, hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the air. Ethan came and went, his presence felt even when he wasn't in the room. By evening, Clara's nerves were frayed. She made dinner, stew again, because it was easy and she didn't trust herself to do anything more complicated, and set it on the table without a word. Noah ate. Ethan ate. No one spoke. It went on like that for 2 more days. Clara worked. Ethan avoided her. Noah tried to fill the silence with chatter, but even he seemed to feel the weight pressing down on the house. On the 3rd day, Clara woke to the sound of voices. She sat up, her heart racing, and listened. It was Ethan and Noah, their voices low and muffled, coming from the main room. Clara slipped out of bed and crept to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Don't understand," Noah was saying, his voice thick with frustration. "Why does she have to leave?" "Because the train's coming tomorrow," Ethan replied. "That was the deal." "But she doesn't want to go." "You don't know that." "I asked her." There was a pause. Clara's breath caught. "You what?" Ethan's voice was sharp. "I asked if she wanted to stay," Noah said, "and she didn't say no." "Noah, she makes things better, Papa. You know she does. The house is warmer, the food's better. She tells me stories, and she doesn't treat me like I'm broken." "I don't treat you like you're broken. You treat me like I'm going to disappear." The words hung heavy in the air. Clara's chest tightened. She shouldn't be listening to this. But she couldn't move. "That's not fair," Ethan said quietly. "It's true, though." Another pause. Longer this time. "She's not staying," Ethan said finally, and his voice sounded hollow. "She has her own life, her own plans. We're just a stop along the way." "Did you ask her?" "I don't need to." "Maybe you should." Clara pulled away from the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her face. Noah had asked if she wanted to stay, and she hadn't said no, because the truth was, she didn't know. When Clara had boarded that train, she'd had a plan. Go to Ridgefield, find Margaret, start over. But now? Now she wasn't sure what she wanted. The thought terrified her. That evening, after dinner, Noah went to bed early. He'd been quieter than usual, his small hands picking at his food, his face drawn. Clara cleaned up while Ethan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The silence between them felt different tonight, heavier, like it was building towards something neither of them wanted to name. Finally, Clara set down the dish she was drying and turned to face him. "The train comes tomorrow," she said. Ethan didn't look up. "I know. You'll be glad to have your house back." "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Ethan's jaw tightened. He stood, crossing to the window, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You did good work," he said. "More than I expected." "That's not much of a compliment." "It's the truth." Clara crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling up again. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Act like caring about anything is a weakness." Ethan turned to face her, his expression hard. "I don't." "Yes, you do. You've been doing it since I got here. You won't let Noah celebrate Christmas. You won't let yourself feel anything that isn't anger or grief. You won't even admit that maybe, just maybe, having someone else in this house has been good for both of you." "It doesn't matter if it's good," Ethan said, his voice rising, "because it's temporary. You're leaving tomorrow. And then what? Noah gets his heart broken again? I have to explain to him why another person he cares about is gone. So your solution is to never let him care about anyone? My solution is to protect him. From what? From life?" Ethan slammed his hand against the wall, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. "From losing someone else," he shouted. The words echoed in the silence that followed. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. Ethan's face was flushed, his eyes wild. He looked like a man coming apart at the seams. "I can't," his voice broke. "I can't do it again. I can't watch him lose someone and not be able to fix it. I barely survived it the first time." Clara's anger drained away, replaced by something softer, sadder. "So you'd rather he lose nothing?" she asked quietly. "Even if it means he gains nothing either?" Ethan didn't answer. Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle now. "You can't protect him from everything, Ethan, no matter how hard you try. Life's going to hurt him. People are going to leave. That's just how it works." "I know that." "Do you?" "Because it doesn't seem like it." Ethan turned away, his shoulders sagging. "What do you want me to say, Clara? That I'm terrified? That I don't know what the hell I'm doing? That every day I wake up and wonder if I'm screwing him up worse than he already is?" "Yes," Clara said. "Say that. Because at least it's honest." Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Honesty doesn't fix anything." "Maybe not, but it's a start." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw the cracks in his armor, saw the man beneath the walls, the father drowning in fear and grief and exhaustion. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Neither do I," Clara admitted, "but I'm still here." Ethan's eyes searched hers, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something, might ask her to stay, or at least admit that he didn't want her to go. But he didn't. He just nodded, his throat working, and turned back to the fire. Clara stood there for a moment longer, then went to bed. The next morning, Clara woke before dawn. She dressed quietly, packed her carpet bag, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small room that had been hers for the past week. It didn't feel like much, but it had been enough. When she stepped into the main room, Ethan was already there, standing by the stove with a cup of coffee in his hands. He didn't say anything when he saw her bag. "Train leaves at noon," Clara said. Ethan nodded. "I'll take you." "You don't have to." "I know." They stood in silence, the weight of unsaid things pressing down between them. Then Noah's door opened. The boy emerged, his hair mussed, his face still heavy with sleep. But the moment he heard Clara's voice, he stopped. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "The train's today," Clara said gently. Noah's face crumpled. "But you can't." "Noah, you can't," he said again, his voice breaking. "Please, please don't go." Clara's throat closed up. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in hers. "I have to," she said softly. "I have family waiting for me, a plan, a life I'm supposed to—" Stay here, Noah interrupted, his hands gripping hers so tightly it hurt. Stay with us. Please, Clara. We need you. You don't need me. Yes, we do. Tears were streaming down his face now. Papa's happier when you're here. The house is happier. I'm happier. Don't you want to be happy? Clara's vision blurred. She looked up at Ethan, silently begging him to say something, to step in, to make this easier. But he just stood there, his face a mask, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. Noah, Clara said, her voice shaking. Sometimes people can't stay, even when they want to. Do you want to? The question cut straight through her. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth was, she didn't know. Or worse, she did know. And it terrified her. She started, then stopped. Noah pulled his hands free and stepped back, his small body trembling. You're just like everyone else, he said quietly. You're leaving, and you're not coming back. Noah, that's not... But he was already gone, disappearing into his room and slamming the door behind him. Clara stayed on her knees, her hands empty, her heart breaking. Ethan set down his coffee and walked past her without a word. Clara heard the creak of Noah's door, the low murmur of Ethan's voice trying to soothe his son. She stood slowly, her legs shaking, and picked up her bag. This was the right thing to do. She had a plan, a destination, people waiting for her. This was just a detour, a mistake. But as she stood there, listening to Noah's muffled sobs through the door, Clara wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Clara stood in the main room with her bag at her feet, listening to Noah's sobs bleed through the walls. Each one felt like a nail being driven into her chest. She'd spent her entire life being the one left behind, the one forgotten, the one people walked away from without a second thought. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that she was used to it. But this was different. This was her doing the leaving, and it felt worse than anything she'd ever endured. Ethan emerged from Noah's room 10 minutes later, his face drawn and pale. He closed the door softly behind him and stood there, not looking at her. Is he... Clara started. He'll be fine, Ethan cut in, his voice flat. He's a kid. Kids get over things. Clara's hands curled into fists. You don't believe that. Doesn't matter what I believe. Yes, it does. Ethan finally looked at her, and the emptiness in his eyes made her stomach turn. You want to stay, Clara? Is that what this is? You want me to ask you? Clara's breath caught. I didn't say... Because I won't, Ethan continued, his voice hard. I won't ask you to give up whatever life you've got planned for this. For us. That's not fair to you, and it sure as hell isn't fair to Noah when you decide 6 months from now that you made a mistake. You think I'd do that? I don't know what you'd do. I barely know you. The words stung more than Clara expected. She picked up her bag, slinging it over her shoulder with more force than necessary. You're right, she said. You don't know me. And maybe that's the problem. She walked to the door, her hand on the latch, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But Ethan just stood there, silent and immovable as stone. Clara pulled open the door and stepped out into the cold. The walk to the station was brutal. The snow had stopped, but the wind cut through her coat like it wasn't even there. Ethan walked ahead of her, his strides long and purposeful, his shoulders hunched against the cold. He didn't slow down, didn't look back. Clara followed, her legs aching, her lungs burning with each breath. They didn't speak the entire way. When the station finally came into view, that same miserable shack where this had all started, Clara felt something inside her crack. She'd survived a week, earned her keep, done exactly what she'd agreed to do. So why did it feel like she was losing something she'd never actually had? Ethan stopped at the platform, such as it was, and turned to face her. Train should be here in about an hour, he said. Clara nodded, setting her bag down. Her hands were shaking, though whether from cold or something else, she couldn't tell. Ethan pulled a small pouch from his pocket and held it out to her. What's this? Clara asked. Payment. For the work. Clara stared at the pouch like it was a snake. I don't want your money. You earned it. I don't care. Ethan's jaw tightened. Take it, Clara. No. Don't be stubborn. I'm not being stubborn, Clara snapped. I'm being honest. I didn't do this for money. I did it because I didn't have a choice. And then I kept doing it because—" She stopped, biting down on the words before they could escape. Because what? Ethan's voice was quiet now, almost dangerous. Clara looked away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. It doesn't matter. It does to me. Why? Clara turned back to him, her voice rising. Why does it matter? You've made it pretty damn clear that I'm just passing through, that this doesn't mean anything, so why pretend you care? Ethan flinched like she'd slapped him. I never said it didn't mean anything. You didn't have to. They stood there in the cold, the wind howling around them, and Clara felt every wall she'd built around herself start to crumble. I spent my whole life being invisible, she said, her voice shaking, being the woman people looked past, the one who didn't fit, who didn't belong, who took up too much space just by existing. And then I came here, and for the first time in my life, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I mattered, that the things I did made a difference, that someone actually saw me. Ethan's face went pale. Clara, but I was wrong, she continued, the words pouring out now, unstoppable. Because you don't see me. You see a problem, a complication, someone who's going to leave and make everything harder. And you know what? You're right. I am leaving, because staying somewhere I'm not wanted is worse than being alone. You think you're not wanted here? Ethan's voice was rough, almost broken. Aren't I? Ethan stared at her, his chest heaving, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually say it, might admit that she was wrong, that he did want her to stay, that the past week had meant something. But he didn't. He just turned and started walking back toward the ranch. Ethan, Clara called after him. He didn't stop. Ethan, damn it, don't you walk away from me. He kept walking. Clara stood there, her bag at her feet, watching him disappear into the white landscape. Her whole body was shaking now, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She wanted to scream, wanted to chase after him and shake him until he admitted what they both knew, but she didn't. Because what was the point? Clara sat down on her bag and pulled her coat tighter around herself. The platform was just as cold and miserable as it had been a week ago. Nothing had changed, except everything had. An hour passed. Then another. The train didn't come. Clara stood and paced the platform, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The schedule had said noon. It was well past that now. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of snow. Clara looked at the horizon and felt her stomach drop. Another storm was coming. She could wait it out here, in the shack. She'd done it before. But the thought of spending another night in that frozen hell made her want to cry. Clara picked up her bag and started walking. Not toward the ranch, toward town. She didn't know how far it was. Didn't know if she'd make it before the storm hit. But she couldn't stay here. Couldn't sit in that shack knowing the ranch was 2 miles away, knowing Noah was probably still crying, knowing Ethan was probably relieved she was gone. She made it about a mile before the snow started falling. Within minutes, it was a full whiteout. Clara pushed forward, her head down, her bag clutched to her chest. She couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her. Couldn't tell if she was still on the road or had wandered off into the emptiness. Her legs gave out. She hit the snow hard, her hands sinking into the cold. She tried to stand, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Everything hurt. Everything was numb. Clara lay there, staring up at the white sky, and thought about how stupid this was. How stupid she was. She was going to die out here because she was too proud to stay where she wasn't wanted, and too stubborn to wait for a train that might never come. Her eyes started to close. Then she heard it. A voice, distant and muffled, calling her name. Clara forced her eyes open. She tried to respond, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The voice got louder, closer. And then Ethan was there, his face appearing above hers like something out of a dream. Clara, he said, his voice sharp with panic. Clara, can you hear me? She tried to nod, but her body wouldn't move. Ethan scooped her up like she weighed nothing, pulling her against his chest. Clara felt the warmth of him, solid and real, and something inside her broke. I've got you, Ethan said, his voice rough. I've got you. Just hold on. Clara tried to tell him she was fine, that she could walk, but the words wouldn't come. She felt herself slipping, the world going soft and dark around the edges. The next thing she knew, she was warm, Clara opened her eyes to find herself in Ethan's bed, buried under what felt like every blanket in the house. The fire was roaring in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. She tried to sit up, but her body protested, every muscle screaming. "Easy," a voice said. Clara turned her head to see Ethan sitting in a chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees, his face drawn and exhausted. "What happened?" Clara's voice came out hoarse. "You collapsed about a mile from the ranch," Ethan said. "I found you just in time." "How did you—" "I came back to the station to wait with you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Train never came. Storm hit. I knew you'd try to walk to town. You came looking for me." "Of course I did." Clara stared at him, her chest tight. "Why?" Ethan let out a long breath and leaned back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Because I'm an idiot," he said finally. Clara almost laughed, but it came out as more of a cough. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got right now." They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. "Noah?" Clara asked. "He's asleep, finally." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "He cried himself sick, wouldn't eat, wouldn't talk, just kept asking when you were coming back." Clara closed her eyes, the guilt washing over her in waves. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. This is my fault." "How is this your fault?" Ethan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the storm. "I've spent 2 years trying to control everything, trying to make sure nothing ever hurts him again, but all I've done is make him afraid to care about anything." "You were trying to protect him." "I was trying to protect myself," Ethan said quietly, "and I used him as an excuse." Clara sat up slowly, wincing at the ache in her limbs. "What are you saying?" Ethan turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "I'm saying you were right," he said, "about all of it. I've been so terrified of losing someone again that I stopped letting anyone in. Stopped letting Noah be happy. Stopped letting myself feel anything that wasn't grief or anger. Ethan, and then you showed up," he continued, his voice rough, "and you didn't ask permission. You just started fixing things. Making the house feel like a home again. Making Noah laugh. Making me remember what it felt like to want something other than just getting through the day." Clara's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to—" "I know. That's what scared me." Ethan crossed back to the bed, sitting down on the edge. "Because wanting something means you can lose it, and I didn't think I could survive that again. So you pushed me away." "I tried to." Ethan's hand found hers, his fingers rough and warm. "But when I went back to that station and saw you were gone, I realized something." "What?" "That losing you because I was too much of a coward to ask you to stay would hurt a hell of a lot more than taking the risk." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "You're asking me to stay?" "I'm begging you to stay." Clara looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "I don't have anything to offer you," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "No money, no promises that this will be easy. Just a broken-down ranch, a grieving kid, and a man who has no idea how to do any of this. But if you'll stay, if you'll give us a chance, I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worth it." Clara couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Say something," Ethan whispered. "Please." Clara pulled her hand free and pressed it to her face, trying to hold herself together. "I don't know how to do this either," she said finally, her voice muffled. "I've never had a home. Never had people who wanted me around. I don't know what I'm supposed to do or how to be what you need." "You're already what we need," Ethan said. "You have been since the first day." Clara lowered her hand and looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the truth written across his face. He meant it, every word. "What about my cousin?" Clara asked. "Margaret's expecting me. Write to her. Tell her you found something else." "What if I mess this up? What if I'm not good enough?" "You won't be. Neither will I. We'll mess it up together." Clara let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her face. "That's a terrible sales pitch. It's all I've got." Clara reached out and took his hand again, squeezing hard. "Okay," she whispered. Ethan's eyes widened. "Okay? I'll stay." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Clara buried her face in his shoulder and let herself cry, let herself feel everything she'd been holding back: relief, terror, hope. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan's eyes were wet too. "We should tell Noah," Clara said. "In the morning. Let him sleep." Clara nodded, exhaustion pulling at her like a weight. Ethan helped her lie back down, tucking the blankets around her with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Get some rest," he said. "Where are you going to sleep?" "The chair's fine." "Ethan, I'm not leaving this room," he said firmly. "Not until I'm sure you're all right." Clara wanted to argue, but she was too tired. She closed her eyes and felt herself drifting. Just before sleep took her, she felt Ethan's hand find hers again. And for the first time in her life, Clara fell asleep knowing she wasn't alone. When Clara woke the next morning, pale light was filtering through the window, and the storm had passed. Her body still ached, but the fog in her head had cleared. Ethan was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back at an angle that was going to leave his neck screaming. He looked younger in sleep. The hard lines of his face softened, the worry smoothed away. Clara sat up carefully, not wanting to wake him. But the moment she moved, his eyes opened. "You should have taken the bed," Clara said. "I'm fine." "You look like hell." "Good morning to you too." Clara smiled despite herself. Ethan stood and stretched, wincing. "How do you feel?" "Like I got dragged through a snowstorm." "You did." "Fair point." Ethan moved to the fire, stirring the embers and adding fresh wood. The flames caught quickly, pushing back the chill in the room. "We should tell Noah," Clara said. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, we should." But neither of them moved. "What if he's still angry?" Clara asked quietly. "He won't be. Not when he knows you're staying." "You sound pretty sure about that." "I am." Ethan turned to face her. "That kid loves you, Clara, more than I think either of us realized." Clara's throat tightened. "I love him too." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest. Ethan's expression softened. "Then let's go tell him." They found Noah in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his hands folded in his lap. He looked small and lost, his face blotchy from crying. When he heard them enter, he turned his head but didn't speak. Clara crossed to him and knelt beside his chair. "Noah," she said gently. He didn't respond. "I need to tell you something." Still nothing. Clara reached out and took his hand, and he flinched but didn't pull away. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I'm staying here, with you and your father, if that's okay with you." Noah's head snapped toward her, his unseeing eyes wide. "You're staying?" "Yes." "For how long?" "For as long as you'll have me." Noah's face crumpled, and then he was throwing his arms around her, sobbing into her shoulder. Clara held him tight, her own tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry," Noah choked out. "I'm sorry I said you were like everyone else. I didn't mean it." "I know," Clara whispered. "I know, sweetheart. It's okay." Ethan knelt beside them, his hand resting on Noah's back. They stayed like that for a long time, the three of them tangled together in the weak morning light. When Noah finally pulled back, he was smiling through his tears. "Does this mean you'll tell me more stories?" he asked. Clara laughed, wiping her eyes. "Every night, I promise." "And you'll make more cake?" "As much as you want." Noah turned to his father. "Papa, she's really staying?" "She really is," Ethan said, his voice thick. Noah threw his arms around Ethan's neck, and Clara watched father and son hold each other, something broken finally starting to heal. Over the next few days, the house began to change in ways that were harder to name but impossible to miss. Clara moved her things from the back room into a space that felt more permanent. She and Ethan worked side by side, their movements gradually finding a rhythm. They didn't talk about what they were or what this meant. They just existed in the same space, learning each other's edges. Noah blossomed. His laughter came easier, louder. He started asking questions again, reaching for Clara's hand whenever she was near, telling her about his day with an enthusiasm that had been missing before. One evening, after Noah had gone to bed, Clara and Ethan sat by the fire. The silence between them was comfortable now, not weighted with unsaid things. I went to her grave today, Ethan said suddenly. Clara looked up from the sock she was mending. Haven't been in months, he continued. Couldn't bring myself to. But today, I went. How was it? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Hard, but necessary. Clara set down the sock and waited. I told her about you, Ethan said, his voice soft. About Noah, about how things are changing. I think... He stopped, swallowing hard. I think she would have liked you. Clara's eyes burned. I wish I could have known her. She was stubborn, like you. Is that a compliment? The highest one I know how to give. Clara smiled through her tears. Ethan reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm terrified, he admitted, every damn day. That I'll mess this up, that something will happen, that I'll lose you like I lost her. You might, Clara said honestly. Life doesn't come with guarantees. I know. But you can't live like you're already grieving something that hasn't happened yet. Ethan looked at her, his eyes shining in the firelight. How'd you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just tired of being afraid. Ethan pulled her closer, and Clara let herself lean into him, her head resting on his shoulder. They sat like that until the fire burned down to embers, holding on to each other in the quiet dark. The fire had burned down to nothing by the time they finally moved. Ethan stood first, offering Clara his hand, and she took it without hesitation. The calluses on his palm had become familiar now, something she noticed and didn't mind. He pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they stood close enough that Clara could feel the warmth radiating from him. You should get some sleep, Ethan said, his voice low. So should you. I will. But neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, heavy with things neither knew how to say. Finally, Clara stepped back, breaking the moment. Good night, Ethan. Good night. Clara made her way to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. This was real. She was staying. The thought should have brought relief, but all Clara felt was the weight of it, the responsibility, the risk of caring about people who could disappear, who could change their minds, who could decide one day that she wasn't enough. But that was the thing about fear, wasn't it? It never really went away. You just learned to live with it. Clara changed into her nightgown and crawled under the blankets, pulling them up to her chin. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the window pane. But inside, the house was warm and quiet. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Clara had expected some kind of shift, some magical transformation where everything fell into place, but life didn't work like that. She and Ethan were learning each other in fits and starts, bumping into sharp edges, discovering what worked and what didn't. He was used to doing everything himself, to not asking for help or admitting when he was overwhelmed. Clara was used to being alone, to second-guessing every decision, to waiting for the other shoe to drop. They fought. Not screaming matches, but tense silences and clipped words that left bruises neither could see. The first real one came 3 weeks after Clara decided to stay. She'd been working in the kitchen, trying to organize the shelves that Ethan had let fall into chaos. He came in from the barn, covered in mud and exhaustion, and stopped short when he saw what she was doing. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Organizing," Clara said, not looking up. "Half of this stuff is expired or moldy. You can't even find anything." "I know where everything is." "Do you?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I've been managing fine." "I'm not saying you haven't. I'm just trying to help." "I didn't ask for help." Clara set down the jar she was holding and turned to face him. "You never ask for help, Ethan. That's the problem." "There's no problem." "Yes, there is. You act like admitting you need someone is the worst thing in the world." Ethan's eyes went hard. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" He didn't answer, just stood there, his hands clenched at his sides, his whole body rigid. Clara crossed her arms. "I'm not trying to take over. I'm trying to be useful. There's a difference." "I know the difference." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you want me here but don't actually want anything to change." "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." Ethan turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, her hands shaking, her chest tight with frustration and hurt. Noah appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, his face worried. "Are you and Papa fighting?" he asked quietly. Clara forced a smile. "Just a disagreement. It sounded like fighting. Sometimes adults disagree. It doesn't mean anything bad." Noah didn't look convinced. "Mama and Papa used to fight sometimes, but they always made up." Clara's throat tightened. "We'll make up too." "Promise?" "I promise." Noah nodded slowly, then crossed to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Clara held him close, her chin resting on top of his head. "I don't want you to leave," he whispered. "I'm not leaving," Clara said firmly. "No matter what." And she meant it. Even when it was hard, even when Ethan pushed back, even when she wanted to scream, she wasn't leaving. Ethan came back an hour later, his face drawn. He found Clara in the barn, feeding the chickens. She heard him approach but didn't turn around. "Clara," he said, I'm busy." "I know, I just..." He stopped, and Clara heard him take a deep breath. "I'm sorry." Clara set down the feed bucket and turned to face him. "For what?" "For being an ass. For making this harder than it needs to be." "Why do you do that?" Clara asked. "Why do you pull away every time someone tries to get close?" Ethan leaned against the barn wall, his shoulders sagging. "Because it's easier than admitting I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm terrified of screwing this up. You think I'm not terrified? You don't act like it." "That's because I've had a lot of practice pretending." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "But the truth is, I'm scared every single day. Scared that I'm not good enough, that you'll realize you made a mistake, that Noah will get tired of me, that I'll wake up one morning and everything will be gone." Ethan's expression softened. "That's not going to happen. You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "I don't, but I'm choosing to believe it anyway." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the effort it took for him to say that, to choose hope over fear. "I don't need you to be perfect, Ethan," she said quietly. "I just need you to let me in, even when it's hard, even when you don't want to." Ethan crossed to her and took her hands in his. "I'll try. I swear I'll try. That's all I'm asking." He pulled her into his arms, and Clara let herself lean into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "We're both terrible at this," Ethan murmured. Clara laughed despite herself. "Yeah, we really are. Think we'll figure it out? Eventually, maybe. Good enough for me." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim light of the barn, the smell of hay and animals thick in the air. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. The winter dragged on, brutal and unforgiving. There were days when Clara couldn't feel her fingers by the time she finished her chores, days when the wind was so fierce it felt like the house might blow away. But there were also moments of unexpected warmth. Noah learning to help with small tasks, his hands careful and deliberate. Ethan smiling more, the hard lines of his face softening. Meals shared around the table, laughter breaking through the silence that had ruled the house for so long. Clara wrote to her cousin Margaret, explaining as best she could. The letter was harder to write than she'd expected. She'd spent so long planning this escape, this new life, and now she was throwing it away for something uncertain. But when she sealed the envelope and handed it to Ethan to mail, she felt lighter. This was her choice, her life, and for the first time it felt like it actually belonged to her. One evening in late February, Clara was in the kitchen preparing supper when Noah wandered in, his hands trailing along the wall. "Clara," he said, "I'm here." He made his way to her, his face serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Noah hesitated, his fingers picking at the hem of his shirt. "Are you going to marry Papa?" Clara nearly dropped the knife she was holding. "What?" "Are you going to marry him, like Mama did?" Clara set down the knife and knelt so she was at eye level with him. "Why are you asking that?" "Because you act like Mama did. You cook and clean and tell me stories and make Papa laugh. And I thought maybe you'd stay forever if you married him." Clara's chest tightened. "Noah, I'm staying forever anyway. I don't need to marry your father for that." "But do you want to?" The question hung in the air, impossible to dodge. Clara thought about Ethan, about the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, the way his hand would find hers across the table, the way he'd started smiling again, slow and cautious, like he was remembering how. I don't know, Clara said honestly. We haven't talked about it. Would you say yes if he asked? Clara's breath caught. I think so, yes. Noah's face lit up, and he threw his arms around her neck. I hope he asks. Me too, Clara whispered, surprised by how much she meant it. But when Ethan came in for supper that night, she couldn't bring herself to mention the conversation. It felt too big, too fragile, so she kept it to herself, tucked away like a secret she was afraid to speak out loud. March came with a thaw that turned the snow to slush and the roads to mud. The chickens started laying again, and the first hints of green began pushing through the frozen ground. Clara found herself watching for spring like she'd never watched for anything before, hungry for proof that things could grow, could change, could survive the worst and come out the other side. One afternoon, while Clara was hanging laundry, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She turned to see a man pulling up to the house, his face weathered and kind. Ethan came out of the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Thomas, he said, and there was something in his voice Clara couldn't quite read. Ethan. The man climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff. Been a while. It has. Thomas glanced at Clara, his eyebrows raising slightly. You must be the woman I've been hearing about. Clara felt her face flush. Clara Bennett. Thomas Farrell. I run the general store in town. He turned back to Ethan. Wanted to come by, see how you're managing. Heard you had some help now. I do, Ethan said, his tone neutral. Thomas smiled. Good. About time. You've been out here alone too long. I haven't been alone. I've got Noah. You know what I mean. There was a pause, heavy with things Clara didn't understand. Well, Thomas said finally, I won't keep you. Just wanted to check in. Let you know if you need anything. You know where to find me. Appreciate it. Thomas tipped his hat to Clara and climbed back onto his wagon. As he drove away, Clara turned to Ethan. Who was that really? She asked. Ethan sighed. A friend, sort of. He's been trying to get me to move to town since Sarah died. Says it's not good for Noah to be out here so isolated. Is he right? I don't know. Maybe. Ethan looked at her. But this is home. It's the only place Noah's ever known. I can't just leave it. Clara nodded slowly. I wasn't suggesting you should. I know. People have opinions about how I should live, what I should do. Gets old after a while. Then stop listening to them. Ethan smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes. Easier said than done. Most things are. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Ethan sat Clara down at the table. There's something we need to talk about, he said. Clara's stomach dropped. What? Ethan took a deep breath. I've been thinking about us, about what this is. Clara's heart started pounding. Okay. When you first got here, I told myself it was temporary, that you'd leave and things would go back to normal, but they haven't, and I don't want them to. Ethan, let me finish. He reached across the table and took her hand. I know we're not perfect. I know I'm difficult and stubborn and probably the worst person you could have ended up with. But I also know that I don't want to do this without you, any of it. Clara's eyes filled with tears. What are you saying? Ethan stood and moved around the table, kneeling in front of her. He pulled a small, tarnished ring from his pocket, and Clara's breath stopped. It was my mother's, he said. Not much to look at, but it's all I have. Ethan, marry me, Clara, not because you have to, not because it makes sense, but because I love you and because I hope, you might love me too. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared at him, at the ring, at the hope and terror written across his face. You love me, she whispered. I do. Think I have for a while now. I was just too much of a coward to say it. Clara let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down her face. You're not a coward. Then what am I? Scared, like me. Ethan's eyes searched hers. Is that a yes? Clara looked at the ring, at this man kneeling in front of her, offering her something she'd never dared to want. A home, a family, a future. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, I'll marry you. Ethan's face broke into a grin, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was too big, sliding around when she moved her hand, but Clara didn't care. She pulled him up and kissed him, tasting salt and relief and something that felt dangerously close to happiness. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. We're really doing this, he said. We really are. You're not going to change your mind? Are you? No. Then neither am I. They told Noah the next morning. He was sitting at the table, eating porridge, when Ethan cleared his throat. Noah, we have something to tell you. The boy set down his spoon, his face wary. What? Clara and I are getting married. For a moment, Noah didn't move. Then his face split into the biggest smile Clara had ever seen. Really? He asked, his voice high with excitement. Really? Clara confirmed. Noah launched himself out of his chair and threw his arms around both of them, laughing and crying at the same time. I knew it, he said. I knew you'd stay forever. Clara held him tight, her heart so full it hurt. This was what belonging felt like. The wedding was small, held in the parlor of Thomas Farrell's house, with only a handful of witnesses. Clara wore the nicest dress she owned, mended and pressed until it looked almost new. Ethan wore his Sunday best, his hair slicked back, his hands shaking slightly as he took her hand. Noah stood between them, holding on to both, his face radiant. The ceremony was short, the words simple, but when Ethan said, I do, his voice was steady and sure. And when Clara said it back, she meant it with every fiber of her being. They were married. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the three of them squeezed together in the wagon. Noah had fallen asleep, his head resting on Clara's shoulder. Ethan's hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. You okay? He asked quietly. More than okay. No regrets? Clara looked at him, at this man who'd found her half frozen in a shack and given her a reason to keep going. None, she said, and she meant it. The ranch felt different when they got back, like it had been waiting for this, for them to finally admit what they were. Ethan carried Noah inside and put him to bed while Clara stood in the main room, looking around at the space that was now officially hers. When Ethan came back, he found her standing by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself. Cold? He asked. No, just thinking. About what? Clara turned to face him. About how different my life would be if I hadn't gotten off that train too early. Ethan crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. You think it was a mistake? No, I think it was exactly what was supposed to happen. Ethan kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. I love you, Clara Ward. The name sent a thrill through her. Clara Ward. Not Clara Bennett, the woman no one wanted. Not Clara the burden, the inconvenience, the one who took up too much space. Clara Ward, wife, mother, home. I love you too, she whispered. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the firelight, two broken people who'd found a way to fit together. It wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was theirs, and that was enough. The first few months of marriage were nothing like Clara had imagined. Not that she'd spent much time imagining it. She'd been too busy surviving to dream about white picket fences and happily ever afters. But if she had imagined it, she probably would have pictured something smooth, easy, two people fitting together like puzzle pieces. Reality was messier. Ethan snored, loudly, and he left his boots wherever he took them off, which meant Clara was constantly tripping over them in the dark. He had a habit of going silent when he was upset, retreating into himself instead of talking things through. Clara wasn't much better. She second-guessed everything, apologized too much, and had a tendency to clean when she was anxious, which meant the house was spotless, but her hands were raw, and her mind was never quiet. They bumped into each other's rough edges constantly, but they also learned. Ethan started leaving his boots by the door. Clara started asking him what was wrong instead of waiting for him to volunteer it. They figured out how to fight without it feeling like the end of the world, how to apologize without making it bigger than it needed to be. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. Spring came in earnest by late April, bringing with it green shoots and warmer days and the kind of light that made everything feel possible. Clara planted a garden behind the house, her hands deep in the soil, her back aching by the end of each day. But she loved it, loved watching things grow, loved the promise of vegetables come summer, loved having something that was entirely hers to tend. Noah helped when he could, his small hands careful as he patted down the dirt around seedlings. He was getting taller, filling out, his face losing some of that haunted thinness. He laughed more now, asked more questions, reached for Clara's hand without hesitation. One afternoon in May, while Clara was weeding the garden, she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw Thomas Farrell pulling up to the house again. This time, he wasn't alone. A woman sat beside him, her face kind and weathered, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Afternoon, Clara," Thomas called out. "Thomas?" Clara walked over, curious. "What brings you out here?" "This is my wife, Margaret," Thomas said, helping the woman down from the wagon. Clara's heart stuttered. "Margaret?" The woman smiled. "Not your Margaret, dear. Different one. Though I did hear you were supposed to be staying with a cousin by that name." Clara felt her face heat. "I was. Plans changed. So I heard." Margaret's smile widened. "Thomas has been telling me about you. Thought I'd come meet the woman who finally got Ethan Ward to smile again." Clara didn't know what to say to that. Ethan emerged from the barn, his expression wary. "Thomas, Margaret." "We brought some things," Margaret said, moving to the back of the wagon. "Fabric, mostly. Thought Clara might want to make some new curtains, maybe some clothes for the boy. He's growing like a weed." Clara's throat tightened. "You didn't have to." "I know we didn't have to, but we wanted to." Margaret pulled out a bundle wrapped in brown paper and handed it to Clara. "Consider it a wedding gift, late but heartfelt." Clara took the package, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you." Margaret studied her for a moment, then reached out and squeezed her arm. "You're doing good here, Clara. I can see it. The house looks alive again." Clara blinked back tears. "I'm trying." "That's all any of us can do." Thomas and Margaret didn't stay long, just long enough to drop off the fabric and share a cup of coffee. But after they left, Clara stood on the porch holding the package, feeling something shift inside her. She wasn't alone in this. There were people who saw what she was doing, who cared. It mattered more than she'd expected. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Clara showed Ethan the fabric. He ran his hand over it, his expression thoughtful. "Margaret's a good woman," he said. "She tried to help after Sarah died, brought food, offered to watch Noah. I pushed her away." "Why?" "Because I didn't want help. Didn't want people seeing how badly I was falling apart." Clara folded the fabric carefully. "And now?" "Now I'm glad they came." Ethan looked at her. "I'm glad you let them." Clara smiled. "I'm learning." "So am I." By summer the garden was thriving. Clara spent her mornings tending it, her afternoons preserving what they didn't eat fresh. The pantry shelves began to fill with jars of pickles, tomatoes, beans. It felt like wealth, like security. Noah turned 9 in July. Clara baked him a cake, lopsided and slightly burned on one side, but he ate 3 pieces and declared it the best cake he'd ever had. Ethan gave him a wooden horse he'd carved, smooth and detailed, with a mane made of real horsehair. Noah ran his fingers over it for hours, memorizing every curve, every line. "Thank you, Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan pulled him into a hug. "You're welcome, son." Clara watched them and felt her chest swell with something too big to name. This was family, imperfect, messy, hard-won family, and it was hers. In August, Clara realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, the nausea, the exhaustion, the way her body felt different in ways she couldn't quite explain. But she'd been too afraid to say anything, too afraid to jinx it. Finally, she couldn't keep it to herself any longer. She told Ethan one evening after supper, while they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "I think I'm pregnant," she said quietly. Ethan went very still. "You think?" "I'm pretty sure." He turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "How sure?" "Sure enough." For a long moment he didn't say anything, just stared at her like she'd spoken a different language. Then his face broke into a smile so wide it made Clara's heart ache. "We're having a baby?" he asked. "We're having a baby." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I didn't think," his voice broke. "I didn't think I'd get this again." "Neither did I," Clara whispered. They sat there in the fading light, holding each other, letting the weight of it settle over them. A baby. A new life. A second chance. Telling Noah was harder than Clara expected, not because she thought he'd react badly, but because she wasn't sure how to explain it, how to make him understand that this didn't mean he was being replaced. But when they sat him down and told him, his reaction surprised her. "Really?" he asked, his face lighting up. "I'm going to be a big brother?" "You are," Ethan said. Noah threw his arms around Clara, his small body shaking with excitement. "I'll help, I promise. I'll help take care of the baby." Clara held him close, tears streaming down her face. "I know you will, sweetheart." That night, after Noah had finally gone to sleep, too excited to settle down for over an hour, Ethan and Clara lay in bed, her head resting on his chest. "You scared?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not a good mother?" "You're already a good mother. Noah adores you." "That's different." "Not really." Ethan's hand found hers in the dark. "You love him. You take care of him. You show up every day. That's what being a mother is." Clara wanted to believe him, but the fear sat heavy in her chest, a constant weight she couldn't shake. The pregnancy was hard. Clara was sick for months, barely able to keep anything down. She lost weight instead of gaining it, her body rebelling against the very thing it was trying to create. Ethan hovered, his worry a constant presence. He took over more of the chores, insisted she rest, brought her water and dry toast, and anything else he thought might help. Noah tried to help too, sitting with her when she was too tired to move, telling her stories he made up, holding her hand when the nausea was particularly bad. "You're going to be okay," he'd say, his voice so certain it almost made her believe it. By October, Clara was finally starting to show. The sickness had eased, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made every task feel monumental. But she pushed through because what else was there to do? One evening, while she was sitting by the fire, Ethan knelt in front of her and placed his hand on her swollen belly. "Can you feel it moving?" he asked. "Sometimes. Little flutters." Ethan's face softened. Sarah used to describe it like that, said it felt like butterflies. It was the first time he'd mentioned his first wife in months. Clara tensed, waiting for the wave of grief to pull him under, but instead, he smiled. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "Glad it's you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Me too." The baby came in late January, during a snowstorm that rivaled the one that had brought Clara to this place. The labor was long and brutal, lasting nearly 20 hours. Ethan sent Noah to stay with Thomas and Margaret, then stayed by Clara's side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement that she barely heard through the pain. When the baby finally came, a girl, small and red-faced and screaming, Clara felt something inside her break open. She'd never held something so fragile, so completely dependent on her. Ethan cut the cord with shaking hands, then wrapped the baby in a blanket and placed her in Clara's arms. "She's beautiful," he whispered. Clara looked down at the tiny face, at the dark eyes staring up at her, and felt her heart expand in ways she didn't know were possible. "What should we name her?" Ethan asked. Clara had been thinking about this for months, turning names over in her mind. But now, looking at this perfect, impossible little person, only one felt right. "Hope," she said quietly. Ethan's eyes widened. "Hope?" "Because that's what she is. What all of this is." Clara looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Hope that things can be different, that broken things can heal, that we can build something good out of the wreckage." Ethan leaned down and kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "Hope it is." The first few weeks with Hope were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, an exhaustion so complete that Clara sometimes forgot what day it was. But there were also moments of startling clarity, the weight of the baby in her arms, the sound of her breathing, the way Noah would sit beside her for hours, just watching, his face full of wonder. Ethan was a different man around Hope, gentler, more patient. He'd get up in the middle of the night when the baby cried, walking the floor with her until she settled, singing old songs Clara had never heard before. "Where did you learn those?" Clara asked one night. "My mother used to sing them. I didn't think I remembered, but I guess I did." Clara watched him sway back and forth, this big, rough man holding a tiny baby like she was made of glass, and felt something settle deep inside her. This was what she'd been looking for her whole life without knowing it. Not perfection, not ease, just this family, this home, this messy, beautiful, impossible life. By spring, Hope was 4 months old and starting to smile. Noah was completely smitten with her, insisting on helping with everything, feeding, changing, even just sitting with her while she slept. "She likes me," he'd say proudly. "I can tell." "She loves you," Clara corrected, "just like I do." The ranch was thriving. The garden was planted again, bigger this time. The animals were healthy. The house was full of noise and life, and the kind of chaos that came with a baby. Clara had never been happier. One afternoon in May, almost 2 years to the day since she'd first arrived, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the property, Hope strapped to her chest, watching Ethan and Noah work in the field. Noah was getting so big now, so capable. He moved with a confidence he hadn't had before, his hands sure and steady. Ethan glanced up and saw her watching. He said something to Noah, then made his way over. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "Just thinking." "About what?" Clara looked out at the ranch, at the life they'd built. "About that train. About how I thought getting off early was the worst mistake I'd ever made." Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "And now? Now I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Ethan pulled her closer, his hand resting on Hope's small head. "Me too." They stood there in the warm spring sun, watching Noah work, listening to the baby coo, and Clara felt a peace she'd never known before. She wasn't the woman she'd been when she stepped off that train. That woman had been broken, desperate, convinced she was worthless. This woman was different. She was a wife, a mother, a person who belonged. She was Clara Ward, and she was finally home. Years passed. Hope grew into a toddler, then a little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. Noah grew tall and strong, learning to navigate the world with a grace that still amazed Clara. He talked about becoming a teacher someday, about helping other children who struggled the way he had. Ethan's hair started to gray at the temples. His hands grew more gnarled from years of work, but his smile came easier now, and the shadows that had haunted him for so long had finally lifted. Clara watched her children grow, watched the ranch prosper, watched the seasons turn, and with each passing year she felt more certain of the choice she'd made. One evening, when Hope was 5 and Noah was 14, Clara found Ethan sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunset. She sat down beside him, taking his hand. "You okay?" she asked. "Just remembering," he said quietly. "Remembering what?" "The day I found you in that shack. Half frozen, stubborn as hell, looking at me like you'd fight me if I tried to help." Clara laughed. "I would have." "I know." Ethan squeezed her hand. "I almost left you there. Told myself it wasn't my problem." "What changed your mind?" "Something in your eyes. This look that said you weren't giving up, that you'd survive with or without my help." He turned to look at her. "I admired that. Even then." Clara's throat tightened. "I was terrified." "So was I." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. From inside the house, Clara could hear Hope laughing at something Noah said, their voices bright and full of life. "We did okay," Ethan said quietly. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We did better than okay." "You think they'll remember this? When they're older? How hard we fought for it?" "I hope so. But even if they don't, it doesn't matter. We know. And that's enough." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Clara Ward." "I love you too." As darkness settled over the ranch, Clara thought back to that frozen platform, to the moment she'd stepped off the train and watched her old life disappear into the storm. She'd thought she was lost, but the truth was she'd been found. Not by chance, not by luck, but by the stubborn refusal to give up, even when giving up would have been easier, by the willingness to step forward instead of back, by the courage to stay when leaving felt safer. Clara had spent her whole life being overlooked, underestimated, told she wasn't enough, but she'd never believed it. Not really. And that had made all the difference. The house behind her was warm and bright, full of the people she loved most. The land stretched out before her, rich and alive with possibility. This was her life. Hard-won, imperfect, real, and she wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not even the worst ones, because those moments had led her here, to this porch, this man, this family, to home. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her children inside, to Ethan's steady breathing beside her, to the wind moving through the trees. And for the first time in her life, she felt complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because she'd finally stopped waiting for permission to claim the life she deserved. She'd stepped off that train too early, yes, but in doing so, she'd found exactly where she was meant to be.